Hello and welcome to the module. In this learning block, we're going to introduce JSF. And in that introduction, what we will do is find out what is meant by facelets and also examine managed beans. This will be a very brief introduction because there's lots of information to convey. And so we're just going to skim the surface this morning. For those of you that have studied with us before, you'll be using information, knowledge that you've gained on previous modules. If you haven't studied with us before, then you will need this kind of background. If not exactly the same, then something similar. So for example, you'll need to know a little bit about modeling with the UML and maybe some kind of design process, such as the Unified Software Development process. You'll also need to know a little bit about Java programming. Not necessarily very extensive or very expert, but you will need to know something about programming and preferably in Java. Because we'll be developing internet applications, you will need to know a little bit about HTML, cascading style sheets, and also SQL. One of the problems with HTML files is that they are static. In other words, once they've been written, nothing changes until the file is edited. So no matter who has requested the file via their web browser, they will always see exactly the same information. Now that's great if the information you're presenting is indeed static and will need to stay unchanged. But think about, for example, accessing an online bank account. You really would not want static information for your balance. You want up-to-date information for your balance. You want to know what transactions you've had recently. And so that needs to be information that is gathered at runtime and then presented in HTML, in other words, dynamically generated. With JavaServer Faces, we have a mechanism whereby we are able to present dynamically generated HTML. And the architecture that we will be using will consist of, well, firstly a web browser for the clients to make use of the web application. And on that web browser, there will be a facelet with at least one link to another facelet. That link could very well be a button. And when you click on the button, that will submit a request to the web server. The web server will receive that request, and because it's a request for a JavaServer Faces page, it will then forward the request to the JSF control servlet. And that control servlet will then process the request in, at the moment, some kind of magical way. And what we will do over the course of this module is to demystify that magic. So the control servlet will process the request in some way, making use of facelets and other components, and then coordinate the response back to the web browser, invoking some kind of view component, and the view component will dynamically generate HTML, which is then sent back to the web browser. Now the control servlet is actually a standard part of the JSF framework. Therefore, we don't write it. We have no direct control over it. What we have to learn is the life cycle that it imposes on that request response transaction. Now what we're going to do in this learning block is take a very simplified view of this life cycle, and then over the course of the next few learning blocks we will add more and more detail in the life cycle. But for now we can just think of it as receiving a request, processing the commands that are sent, and then sending some kind of response back to the client. So this simplified life cycle can be broken down into the following. When a request is received by the JSF control servlet, the first thing it will do is to build a component tree. So if I draw on the board here the control servlet, and here is a request coming into the control servlet, what it will do is look at the facelet structure that has sent us the request. So for example, there might be an HTML form. That form might have a text field in which the user can type information. Well, that form, with all its components, is going to have a structure. That's what the component tree represents. So for example, let's call it V1, that's the view. Maybe there's a file, an XHTML file, which contains an HTML form. So that's the second box down, I've labeled it form. Then, within that form, there might be, for example, some kind of header. I've labeled that H1. And then perhaps there's going to be some kind of text box for the user to enter information. I'm just going to call that TB. Now, the information that the user has typed into that text box will be sent as part of the request. So there will be a parameter on the request that is received by the control servlet, and that parameter will have the name of the text box and the value that the user typed. Well, that value is then entered into the component tree for that text box. And so on the diagram, we then have TB with a value of Graham in double quotes because it'll be a string. So the control servlet has built this component tree and populated it with the values that have come from the request. The next stage is for the control servlet to create an instance of a managed bean. We'll talk more about that in a minute. And then copy the values from the component tree into the properties of the managed bean. Now, a property is a three-part construct within the bean. First of all, there will need to be a field. So it will just be an ordinary variable that's declared, for example, int num or string name and so on. With each field, typically, we would expect there to be a set method so that the value of the field can be changed, and also a get method so that we can retrieve the current value that is held in that field. When the managed bean has been updated with all the values from the component tree, there might then be some kind of processing that takes place. Maybe a method is called within that managed bean that will process the data in some way. We're not going to worry too much about how that happens today. Then it comes to the point where in the lifecycle we need to send the response. Well, that response will be sent via another view, an XHTML form. That new view will also have a structure. So the control servlet will build a second component tree which will consist of elements. So maybe there's an H1 tag, maybe there's an H2 tag, then perhaps there's going to be some kind of output value. We'll give that a name, we'll just call that OP for output, and it's going to take a value. So maybe in this very simple example, we're just going to echo what was received by the control servlet on the request. So that value is going to come from the managed bean. Let me just recap then. So the control servlet has put into the first component tree the value for the text box that was typed by the user. That value will then have been put into the managed bean. And so now we can use the get method to retrieve that value from the managed bean and put it into the component tree. That's what the control servlet does. Finally, the control servlet's job will be to take the values that are in this second component tree and output it as the response back to the web browser. And so that is a simplified view of the JSF lifecycle. So here's a very simple example. In fact, it's so simple it doesn't even have any input. What we're going to do is just simply send an HTTP GET request for index.xhtml. Now this is a very simple view. It's got an H1 tag saying very simple example. It's got an H2 tag with the static text current time : space, and then a dynamic piece of information which is the current time. So this life cycle that we've just looked at will have no input coming in other than just the request. So the component tree which will be built won't have any data on it that has come from the user. We'll need a managed bean, the job of which is simply to retrieve the current system time and then make it available for when the second component tree is built, which is going to be the output view. And that's the one that you can see on screen at the moment. So the component tree will be built with the H1 tag, the H2 tag, and that dynamically generated bit of information, which instead of being a name such as Graham, will be the current system time. So this is how it's done in the code. In the XHTML file, you can see that we have got on the third line an HTML tag, in which we have declared two XML namespaces. Now these two are pretty standard. So when you want to use XHTML, you will always have lines 3 and 4 that you can see on screen. Now you can see highlighted in red on line 4 a suffix called H. That is a user-defined suffix. So I've called it H, you could call it anything you wanted. And that is made equal to this namespace that essentially defines the core HTML elements that will be used throughout the rest of this document. So you can see on line 5, for example, we're using from the H library a head element. Now I know it's from the H library because that suffix on line 4 has now become the prefix for that head tag. And then on line 11, you can see again that prefix H with the output text element. So all of these tags are in the library that is defined in that namespace on line 4. As you look down through there, you'll see some static stuff. Line 6, for example, static, never going to change. Line 9, line 10, again, static, never going to change. But on line 11, we have got some dynamic information. And that is being displayed in an output text element. Now, the lovely thing about XHTML is that the element will be rendered in a way that is appropriate to the browser or the client, it might be a mobile device, that is currently viewing this page. So if you look at that output field in one browser, it might look a little bit different from an output field in another browser. This is particularly noticeable on input fields. So we'll see an example in a few minutes about an input text element. But for now, let's stick with this output text element. And you can see that it has a value. This is where we define the value that we want to be output. So value equals, and then in double quotes, we could either put a literal value, or what we're doing here is using an expression language value, and that is introduced with the hash, open brace, and then close brace. And in between the braces, we have the name of a managed bean, time utility, dot, and then a property name. Now, although we put the property name there, the JSF control servlet will work out from the context whether it needs to call the get current time method or the set current time method. Well, since we're outputting, that means that we need to retrieve from the managed bean the current value of the property, and therefore we'll call get current time. So what about that managed bean, time utility? Well, you can see that this is actually a pretty simple class. Look at line 10, public class time utility. So it's just a standard class, nothing particularly tricky about it. Line 12, we're declaring a variable of type simple date format, which will help us to take a date object and convert it into a string whose format is defined at the end of line 12. So hours, minutes, seconds, dot, milliseconds. Then on line 14, we have the get current time method that will provide a value for the current time. So you can see on line 16, calendar.getInstance.getTime will retrieve the time at the time that method is called, set it up as a date object. That becomes a parameter on the format method, whose job is to convert it into a string according to the format string on line 12, and then just return that string. So a very simple class. Now a couple of things to note. What makes this a managed bean? Well, line 8. Here you have an annotation called named, and value equals the name by which this class will be known as a managed bean. Now I've just taken the default here. In fact, if you didn't provide a value, time utility would be the name of this particular managed bean, because the convention, or the default, is that you take the class name and replace the first letter with a lowercase letter. But I could, if I wanted, have a completely different name for this managed bean. I could call it my magic bean if I wanted to, and that would be the value that I provided on the named annotation. So that immediately makes it a managed bean, which means that the control servlet will be in charge of the instantiation, the invocation, and the destruction of instances of this bean. On line 9, we've got another annotation which says that this bean exists only for the duration of the request. In another learning block, we will talk a lot more about the various requests. So with this particular lifecycle, as I've mentioned before, there's no input information, so there's not really going to be a component tree or a managed bean to populate. There are no commands to process. It's only on output, when we're building the component tree for the response, that we need the managed bean. Therefore, the control servlet will instantiate time utility, managed bean. Then we'll call the getCurrentTime method, which grabs the current time, returns it as a string. That's the component tree built, and now the control servlet will render the view, making use of the information provided in the index.xhtml file, and will also use the values that have come out of the component tree. So here's a slightly more complicated example, only very slightly more complicated, in as much as we've got two views now, an input view and an output view. On the input view, we've got a text box and a submit button. So those two elements are going to be part of an XHTML form. That form will have a text box and a control button, and when the control button is submitted or clicked by the user, the contents of that text box will be submitted and sent to the control servlet. The control servlet will build a component tree, as in the diagram I showed you a bit earlier. It will then take the value of that text box, put it into the component tree, then, when everything's okay, copy all those values into a managed bean, and those values can then be retrieved from the managed bean for the production of this second view. So in the simple example.xhtml file, you can see on line 10 the XHTML form element. Nested within it, as well as a paragraph, there's an input text element. That element is what will produce a text box. Now that can look quite different depending on the browser that you're using. The value for that text box, that's where we link or bind, that's the technical term, we bind this text box to a property in the managed bean. So again, what we're saying here with the input text element, the value equals, double quotes, and then hash, open brace, user.name, close brace. That says whatever the user types in this text box is destined for the property in the user managed bean. That will cause the control servlet to create an instance of the user managed bean, then call the setName method, passing whatever the user typed in the text box as the parameter to that method. So the field called name will end up with, in this example, the value Graham. The command button has got a couple of things on it. Type equals submit. So that tells the environment, the runtime environment, that the user, when clicking this button, wants to submit the form data to the web server. The value is what will be displayed on the front of the button. So I've got the word submit, but if I wanted to change that to send data, then send data will be displayed on the button in the web browser. Action, well, that tells us the destination. In other words, the second view. So by clicking on the command button, the control servlet will receive the form data and will also be told that the next view is viewTime.xhtml. Now the user managed bean, again, is very simple. It's got on line 10, the one field, line 12, the getName method, and on line 17, the setName method. All standard stuff. Line 6 is the annotation that makes this a managed bean with the name of user. Again, that could be anything you wanted, but I've just kept it at the default value. This time, because there is some form data coming in, the first component tree will be built in the way that was explained in the diagram earlier on. There's nothing to process here because all we're doing is saving the data into the managed bean and then retrieving it immediately for the second view. So that second view is timeview.xhtml. Another component tree is built. Values are copied from the managed bean into that second component tree, and then that component tree is used for rendering the view. There's another video that you can watch. This is an illustration of how to build these examples in NetBeans. And by the time you've seen that video and you've thought about all of this information that I've just presented, and you've had a go at the tutorial, by the end of this learning block, therefore, you should be able to name the major components in a JavaServer Faces application, and you should be able to describe a simplified JSF lifecycle. In addition to that, you should then feel fairly comfortable about writing a simple facelet, also a simple managed bean, and linking or binding properties in the bean to fields